When British photojournalist Callum Hayes crossed into war-torn Syria with nothing but a camera and a mission he expected danger, but not this. Captured by armed militants and facing a terrifying fate, Callum found himself on the brink of being sold to ISIS. But then, something unthinkable happened. Not a rescue team, not a ransom, a soccer conversation. What unfolded next wasn't just survival. It was a story so strange, so human, it defied everything we thought we knew about enemies, war, and mercy. Stay with us, because what saved his life might be the most unexpected twist you've ever heard. While most kids asked for video games or sneakers for their birthdays, Callum Hayes begged for a disposable camera. Born and raised in Leeds, England, Callum's obsession with photography began early, long before he understood what an f-stop or shutter speed even was. There was something magical about waiting to see what the film would reveal, and even more magical when the images matched what he saw in his mind's eye. His parents, both public school teachers, hoped he'd grow out of it. Instead, he grew into it. Callum was never a fan of academics, to the dismay of every guidance counselor he ever met. He barely graduated secondary school and dropped out at 16. Not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. He already knew what he wanted. He landed an unpaid internship with a gritty local photographer who specialized in crime scenes and back alley portraits. The work was intense, sometimes disturbing, but it sharpened his eye and toughened his nerves. After a year of hauling gear and dodging angry drunks, Callum struck out on his own. He freelanced for anyone who would pay a wedding here, a protest there, and slowly built a portfolio that showed both range and raw instinct. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And for someone like Callum, real mattered. He didn't chase the perfect shot. He chased the true one, the moment that said more than words could. He just didn't know then that one day that pursuit might cost him his life. By the time Callum turned 24, his portfolio had started to draw serious attention, not from fashion magazines or glossy travel sites, but from the kind of editors who knew the difference between picturesque and powerful. One of those editors worked at the Chronicle, a legacy newspaper in London, with deep roots and a reputation for sending photographers into places most people couldn't even pronounce. When the email came through subject line "Overseas Opportunities," Callum didn't hesitate. He threw on his best thrift store blazer and headed into the interview with sweaty palms and zero expectations. To his shock, he got the gig. The first few assignments were in safer zones: Kosovo, southern Turkey, even brief work in Cairo. But the real test came in early 2014. The pitch was straightforward, but nerve-wracking: embed with rebel groups in Syria and document the shifting power dynamics as the civil war dragged into its third year. The job would involve slipping across the Turkish border and linking up with contacts from the Free Syrian Army, a once moderate rebel faction now struggling to survive between Assad's forces and a rising tide of jihadist groups. There would be no armed escort, no insurance for what couldn't be explained, just Callum, his camera, a veteran reporter named Stephen Bloom, and a fixer known as Hassan, waiting on the other side. Callum said yes without blinking. Not because he didn't fear the danger, but because he feared missing the truth more. And if truth lived anywhere in 2014, it was buried under the rubble of Aleppo, Syria, a city torn in two, where every photo could be your last, and every moment might be the one history remembers. The assignment didn't come with a map, only coordinates and a warning. Don't get caught. Callum and Stephen landed in Gaziantep, Turkey, in late February 2014, with nothing but a few backpacks, press IDs, and a suitcase stuffed with first aid supplies and power banks. From there, they headed south, by van creeping through dusty villages and military checkpoints, until they reached the border under cover of darkness. There would be no passport stamps, no official entry. This wasn't travel. It was trespass, their contact. Hassan, a wiry Syrian man in his 30s, with a calm voice and quick eyes, met them just outside Kilis. He said very little as he led them down a footpath, flanked by barbed wire and barren olive groves. Somewhere beyond that scrubland was Syria, a country where the war wasn't a headline, but a constant breathing thing. As they stepped into Syrian soil, Callum felt the weight shift, not just from the gear strapped to his back, but from the sudden raw awareness that he was on his own. No embassy could pull strings, no hotline would answer. If things went sideways, they would vanish without a trace. They drove through the outskirts of Aleppo, passing skeletons of apartment blocks and walls, cratered by shell fire. This wasn't just a war zone, it looked like another planet. Their destination was a district called Kamal al-Mashariq, where they would meet with fighters from the Free Syrian Army, still considered moderate, though increasingly surrounded by radical factions with darker agendas. Callum checked his camera, then looked at Stephen. "This is it," he said. Stephen nodded, eyes scanning the horizon. "Welcome to the deep end." They had no idea just how deep it would get. Jabal al-Mashariq wasn't much more than a shattered suburb clinging to life. But for Callum and Stephen, it became home for their first week in Syria. Their host was Tariq al-Masri, a former schoolteacher turned rebel commander who had traded chalkboards for AKs after witnessing his brother executed in the streets of Homs. Despite the hardened edge in his voice, Tariq still carried the patience of a man used to explaining things. He welcomed the journalists cautiously, then gradually opened up as they offered cartons of cigarettes and crates of painkillers, small luxuries in a place where even aspirin was gold. Days were filled with shooting, not just bullets, but photos. Callum moved through bombed-out apartments, makeshift clinics, and food lines, capturing images that froze chaos into clarity. He was surprised by how quickly he adapted to the noise, the heat, and the smell of burned rubber and wet concrete that clung to everything. Nights were surreal, tea brewed over barrel fires, laughter echoing between bursts of distant shelling, and an occasional rooftop soccer match played with a deflated ball. Through it all, Hassan translated stories of grief and resistance. Tariq's men respected Stephen. He'd been there before, but Callum, young and new, had to earn his place. After showing them a photo of a rebel gently wrapping a wounded boy's arm in gauze, he did. It wasn't peace, it wasn't safety, but it felt strangely steady. Had they left after that first week, they might have walked away with nothing more than dust-stained boots and an incredible story. But war has a way of hiding its worst turns until you're too deep to reverse. And for Callum, the next move would change everything. It was supposed to be a short drive just 5 or 6 miles east to connect with a second rebel unit operating on the city's edge. Tariq had arranged the meeting, vouching for the group's relative stability. Callum packed light, thinking it would be an afternoon run, a few interviews, maybe a shot or two, and back before sunset. But in war, distance is deceptive and familiarity can get you killed. The streets of Aleppo had changed since Stephen's last visit. Landmarks were gone, swallowed by airstrikes. Buildings that once stood as reference points were now twisted rebar and dust. Even the sky seemed different, ashier, thicker. As they drove through an area that looked like every other block, Hassan squinted at a crossroads, then turned left. In hindsight, that single move felt like the moment the ground tilted. Within minutes, they knew something was off. The people waiting at the meeting point weren't waving. They weren't smiling. They weren't FSA. They were armed, masked, and approaching fast. One barked in Arabic, another slammed the butt of his rifle against the hood. Hassan barely whispered, "Don't speak, don't run." They were yanked from the vehicle and ordered to kneel. Cameras were confiscated, passports taken. A third man blindfolded them with strips of cloth that smelled like oil and metal. For Callum, the world shrank to sound and instinct-heavy boots on gravel, distant gunfire, the metallic snap of a weapon's safety being clicked off. For a few heart-thudding hours, they weren't journalists. They were bargaining chips. No one spoke English. No one offered names. It wasn't until nightfall that they were tossed into the back of a pickup and driven for what felt like hours When the blindfolds finally came off, they weren't at another rebel camp. They were prisoners in a compound controlled by a group they'd never heard of, but would come to know all too well. The compound was nothing more than a bombed-out school, fortified with sandbags and gunmen. Inside, Callum and Stephen were kept in a dim basement room that reeked of diesel and mold. Their hands were zip-tied. Hassan, their translator and driver, was held separately, but still within shouting distance. The group that had taken them spoke little, but when they did, it was clear they weren't just random militants. They were connected, organized, and dangerous. After 2 tense days, Callum began to piece together the truth. Through snippets of broken Arabic and Hassan's guarded translations, they learned that the men who captured them were not part of the Free Syrian Army. They were affiliated with a jihadist faction operating out of Raqqa, and the plan wasn't to hold them for ransom, it was to sell them. "They're worth more dead than alive," Hassan whispered one night, eyes hollow. The Raqqa-based group, still publicly unknown, had a growing reputation for brutality. Its fighters didn't just kill Westerners, they filmed it. Their propaganda videos were edited like movie trailers and distributed like warnings. The group, Hassan later explained, was offering the equivalent of $40,000 for both Callum and Stephen, an investment really. They'd flipped the footage into millions in global exposure, terror recruitment, and ransom pressure. To their captors, it was just business. Callum sat there, chilled to the bone, staring at the dirty concrete wall. This wasn't just a war zone anymore, it was a chessboard, and they were pawns being moved toward execution for spectacle. And unless something changed fast, that footage would be their legacy. The next few days blurred into a surreal routine. No chains, no beatings, just waiting, wondering, dreading. The guards who once barked orders started softening. They brought food, tea, even unfiltered cigarettes. It wasn't compassion, it was logistics. Their captors had been told to keep Callum and Stephen alive, unharmed, and presentable. The deal had already been brokered. The buyers from Raqqa were expected within 48 hours. Callum tried to stay calm, but his nerves were fraying. He watched one guard spend 20 minutes trying to light a damp match. Another leaned against the wall, scrolling through photos on a beaten-up phone, as if all this was normal. Hassan, still acting as a go-between, began chatting more openly with the men. "They don't hate you," he told Callum. "They just need money." One of the guards, a man named Abu Qadir, emerged as the de facto leader. He wasn't cruel, just cold calculated, but every so often, he'd crack a smile or ask odd questions about life in England. What did people eat there? What did houses look like? Did everyone really watch Netflix? Callum answered when he could, unsure if honesty would help or hurt. Still, it was better than silence. Anything was better than silence. Because in silence, Callum imagined what those Raqqa men would do when they arrived, and whether anyone back home even knew he was gone. But he never could have predicted what would come next, or that a conversation about soccer would flip everything upside down. It started with a cigarette and a question. Abu Qadir lit one with a cracked plastic lighter and casually asked Hassan which football team Callum supported. At first, Callum thought it was a trap, a weird psychological test. But when Hassan translated the question, he answered truthfully. Sheffield Wednesday. Abu's eyes lit up in surprise. English football, he said in halting English, pointing at Callum with a faint smile. You know, Algerian player Rachid Jeriou? Callum blinked. Rachid Djebour, he asked, trying to parse the accent. Or Adel Tairabt? Abu practically jumped. Tairabt, QPR. Very good, 2010. Backheel goal. The mood in the room shifted like someone had flipped a switch. Suddenly, Abu wasn't a militant, he was a fan. For the next hour through Hassan's translations, they talked football. Not politics, not religion, just goals, tactics, and championship stats. Abu recited Tarabt's 19 goals and 16 assists. From memory, then mimicked the infamous Boxing Day goal, the back heel, the dribble, the rocket into the top left corner. It was absurd. It was hilarious. And it was utterly human. The other guards gathered around, curious about the commotion. Soon, Callum and Abu were acting out famous goals in the middle of a war-torn hallway, while Stephen shook his head in disbelief. For Callum, the tension in his chest loosened for the first time in days. Not because they were safe, they weren't, but because he saw something real behind Abu's eyes. Something not twisted by ideology or desperation, just a man who loved the game. That night, Abu offered tea and better food. He even handed back Callum's watch and let him sit outside for a few minutes under the stars. "You love football like I do," Abu said through Hassan. "Maybe you don't deserve Raqqa." It was the first time Callum allowed himself to hope. Not trust, not relax, just hope. Because maybe, just maybe, the thing that would save his life wasn't politics, press credentials, or money. Maybe it was a backheel goal scored 4 years earlier in a stadium 2,000 miles away. 2 nights after the football talk, Abu asked to speak with Callum alone with Hassan. Translating, of course. They stepped into a quiet stairwell, still scarred from shellfire. Abu lit a cigarette, his hands trembling ever so slightly, and looked Callum in the eyes, for the first time not as a guard, but as a man wrestling with something heavy. He spoke in low tones, glancing toward the hallway, like someone might be listening. Hassan translated in pieces. "They want you in Raqqa by morning. I told them we'd deliver you." "But," Abu hesitated, "I think they want your death, not your ransom." Callum didn't speak. He didn't breathe. Abu continued, "I thought maybe football made you human to me, or maybe I just remembered I was human too." Abu explained his plan. He would tell his commanders that their compound had come under attack from government forces. Amid the chaos, the prisoners Callum, Stephen, and Hassan escaped. It was a dangerous lie. If they found out, Abu would be executed. "But I want to believe not everything here must end in blood," he added quietly. Then he made 2 requests. They must leave Aleppo that night immediately without delay. And Callum had to give him something small, something personal to remember him by. Callum didn't hesitate. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn Sheffield Wednesday keychain, the one he'd carried since he was 16. "You keep this," he said, "and you keep breathing." Abu took it without a word. By sunrise, Callum and Stephen were back with Tariq's men, safe for now. They never saw Abu again, but they owed him everything. They crossed the border under moonlight, moving fast and quiet. No photos, no farewells, just dust, diesel, and the hum of a borrowed truck rattling toward safety. By the time Callum and Stephen boarded their connecting flight out of Istanbul, the men from Raqqa would have arrived at the empty compound to find nothing but silence and cigarette ash. Back in London, the Chronicle ran Stephen's story as planned. Front page, full color, a compelling look inside the fractured rebel movement. Callum's photographs were featured prominently blurred silhouettes in bombed hallways, children laughing behind sandbags, a rebel medic stitching wounds by candlelight. But nowhere did they mention the kidnapping, the basement cell, or Abu Qadir. It wasn't cowardice, it was caution. Even the suggestion of that truth could have gotten Abu killed, or worse, exposed other reporters still operating inside Syria. The editors agreed the story behind the story would remain unpublished, at least for now. Callum kept the images from the compound locked away in a password-protected drive, unseen by anyone but him. And when people asked how close he'd come to danger, he gave them the usual half-truths. "Yeah, it got intense," he'd say, "but I made it out." What he never said out loud, what no headline captured, was this: he was alive because one man trapped in a war like everyone else chose compassion over orders. Years have passed since Callum Hayes stepped foot in Aleppo. The city, once a brutal chessboard of factions and ruins, has been reclaimed, rebuilt, and in many ways erased. Abu Qadr disappeared into the fog of war like so many others. No records, no photos, no way to know if he survived the inevitable purges that followed the fall of rebel strongholds. Callum still carries the memory like a scar tucked behind the lens. He's photographed hurricanes in the Gulf, protests in Hong Kong, refugee camps in the Balkans. But none of those places ever felt as personal as that compound, that smoky hallway, that awkward soccer reenactment with a man who should have been his executioner. He wonders sometimes, did Abu make it out? Does he still have the keychain? Did he ever make it to the UK like he once joked? He would? Maybe someday I watch a match, he had said, real match, not on phone. So Callum ends every talk, every lecture, every classroom visit with a message. One he knows is unlikely to be heard but worth speaking. Anyway, Abu, if you're alive, if by some miracle you're reading this, there's a seat waiting for you at Hillsborough. I'll bring the tea. You bring the stories. And we'll watch the game no guns, no war. Just football. And if I never see him again, that's okay too. Because somewhere in the middle of a war between concrete walls and the smell of fear, one man chose grace. And sometimes that's enough to keep believing in people. In April 2016, Malik Rhodes was 24 and working his second year at a logistics firm in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. That Saturday night, he and his best friend Trey Harmon were heading to a birthday party thrown by one of their mutual friends, Kelsey Navarro. It wasn't just any birthday either. Kelsey was turning 23, and her parents had agreed to let her use their home in the upscale Santa Maria neighborhood for the celebration. For two guys in their 20s, that meant one thing: a big night ahead. The music was already booming in Malik's car. Trey was queuing up their favorite pre-party tracks, and everything about the evening seemed to hum with excitement. Santa Maria, known for its luxury homes, sprawling lawns, and manicured streets, felt like the perfect backdrop for a night of fun and flirtation. The only hiccup, neither of them really knew the layout of the neighborhood. Trey had the address somewhere in his texts, but they were already running late and trying to navigate unfamiliar streets while blasting music wasn't exactly a recipe for smooth arrival. Still, the mood was high and both guys were hyped. Malik had even taken time to clean his car for the first time in weeks. They joked that this would be the kind of night they'd talk about for years. And in a way, they were right. Just not for the reasons they thought. What started as an ordinary drive to a house party would soon veer into something far darker. By the time they crossed over into the outer edge of Santa Maria, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the tree-lined streets, turning the neighborhood into a patchwork of golden light and deep, creeping shade. Malik had never driven through this part of town before. It was like stepping into a different world. One where every house looked like it had been plucked from a magazine cover: multi-story facades, ornate gas lanterns, brickwork driveways, and trimmed hedges that whispered money. But it was also confusing as hell. Trey, half distracted with the playlist and half scrolling through messages, muttered something about a 7714 Manchac. That was it, the text from someone already at the party. Except Manchac wasn't a street. It was practically a theme. As they entered the inner loop of the neighborhood, Malik and Trey were met with a barrage of similarly named streets: Manchac Way, Manchac Trace, Manchac Crossing, and Manchac Lake Drive. It was like someone had used a random generator and forgot variety was a thing. They circled around twice before turning onto what they assumed was the right road, Manchac Trace, and saw a house with a handful of cars parked outside. The house was dark, but so were most of the homes nearby. Maybe they're in the backyard, Trey suggested. That's where the pool is, right? It made sense. Kelsey had said the party was going to be outdoors, so her parents wouldn't get mad if people spilled red punch all over the rugs. There were no party lights, no music, no laughter drifting into the night, just silence. But with a row of vehicles lining the curb and no street numbers clearly visible, it seemed like a decent guess. Malik slowed the car, pulling into the driveway with a slight crunch of gravel beneath the tires. They both stared at the quiet house for a moment. Trey squinted through the windshield. "Should I knock?" he asked, casually, fingers already reaching for the door handle. Malik hesitated. Something felt off. Not in a horror movie kind of way, more like a gut-level weirdness that tightened his stomach. "Maybe we should double-check first," he offered. But Trey just smirked. What's the worst that could happen? They were about to find out. Before Malik could open his mouth to argue, Trey had already stepped out of the car. He didn't slam the door, just clicked it shut like they were pulling up to any other house party. He stood there for a moment, phone in hand, its bright screen casting a bluish glow across his face and shirt. Malik stayed behind the wheel, the engine still idling, his eyes bouncing between the quiet house and the motionless windows. The front porch light was off. The windows were dark, curtains drawn. Yet, as Trey took a couple steps toward the door, something shifted in one of the upstairs windows, just a flicker of movement. Malik's eyes narrowed. Was that someone watching Trey? Malik called, his voice suddenly sharper. "I really don't think this is it, man." But Trey didn't turn around. He was busy reading something on his phone, probably another text that came in late. That glow in his hand, so harmless under normal circumstances, now felt like a target painted across his chest. Then, like the snap of a trap, everything happened at once. A deafening crack rang through the air. Malik's windshield exploded inward, sending a shower of jagged glass across the dashboard and onto his lap. The sound was so sharp, so alien, he didn't even recognize it as gunfire at first. But then came the next shot and the next. Each one punched into the vehicle with brutal force. Malik screamed, ducked down, hands flailing for the gear shift. His ears rang. The world went slow and sharp at the same time. From the corner of his eye, he saw flashes of light from the upstairs window, muzzle flashes. Whoever was in that house was firing at them. Trey Malik yelled, heart pounding, "Get in the car! Get in the car!" But when he turned his head, Trey was already slumped against the passenger side door, the phone still glowing dimly in his lap. Blood was running down his side, soaking into his shirt. Malik didn't wait. A voice not his own, something primal and terrified, screamed in his mind. "Put it in reverse, or you're both dead." He yanked the gear stick, stomped the gas. The tires shrieked against the driveway as the car jolted backward, fishtailing slightly before regaining traction. Glass crunched beneath the wheels. Another bullet cracked the rear windshield. Malik's hands trembled as he shifted into drive and roared down the quiet suburban street, heart slamming so hard it hurt. Wind blasted through the ruined windshield. He could barely breathe. He stole a glance at Trey, still breathing but barely. His skin was ghostly pale, mouth open, like he couldn't get air. Malik knew they didn't have much time. There was no time to think, only to move, only to survive. Malik's hands were slick on the steering wheel, not just from sweat, but from something warmer, something sticky. He didn't know if it was Trey's blood or his own. He didn't dare look down. The windshield was gone. The roar of the wind in his ears was deafening, and he could feel bits of glass still lodged in his sleeves and hair. His mind was split in two, one half focused on keeping the car steady, weaving through late-night traffic on the I-10 like a bat out of hell, the other half spiraling in sheer panic. Trey wasn't speaking. His chest rose and fell in shallow, jerky movements, like he was breathing through a straw. Malik kept talking to him anyway. "You're good, man. We're almost there. Stay with me." Not knowing if his friend could hear a single word, he floored it past 3 exits before spotting the glowing green sign, Baton Rouge General, 1/4 mile. That short distance felt like a marathon. He took the exit ramp too fast and nearly clipped the curb, the tires squealing in protest. The streets blurred past in streaks of amber and black. When he pulled into the ER loop, Malik didn't even park. He slammed the gear into park right in front of the sliding doors and launched himself out of the car. "Help! I need help!" he screamed, rounding to the passenger side and yanking open the door. Trey slumped forward, his lips barely moving, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Malik reached out, touched his shoulder, shook it. "Trey, stay with me, bro. You're good. You're good." A nurse and 2 paramedics rushed out with a stretcher. They didn't ask questions. They didn't have to. One look at the blood-soaked seat was enough. As they pulled Trey out of the car, Malik backed up, hands shaking, breath coming in shallow bursts. The adrenaline was fading now, and all that was left was raw fear. And the unbearable thought, what if I'm already too late? The waiting room at Baton Rouge General felt like a sterile purgatory, suspended between 2 realities: what had just happened and whatever was coming next. Malik sat there in his blood-smeared hoodie glass, still clinging to his jeans. Hands clasped tight as if squeezing them together could hold Trey's life in place. The fluorescent lights were harsh, buzzing faintly above, and every time the automatic doors slid open, Malik looked up with a jolt of hope that never landed. Nurses came and went, calling out names that weren't his. A television in the corner played muted reruns of some cooking show, completely out of sync with the terror tightening in his chest. His phone buzzed endlessly, texts from friends at the party, wondering where they were, some asking if the cops were outside, others thinking it was just some bad prank. Malik didn't answer. He kept replaying the moment Trey slumped in the car, the gurgling sound of his breathing, the blood soaking into the seat, and that question kept looping in his head. Why him, not me? After what felt like hours, but was likely just 40 minutes, a doctor stepped into the room and called Malik's name. His legs were jelly as he stood up, following the man down a short hallway into a quieter area of the ER. The doctor didn't waste time. "Your friend's alive," he said simply, and Malik nearly collapsed right there. The doctor explained the bullet had entered Trey's chest, but missed the heart and major arteries. His lung had collapsed, which was why he was struggling to breathe. They'd inserted a chest tube to reinflate it and stop internal bleeding. One rib was broken, but nothing life-threatening. Trey was now stable and had been moved into the ICU. The wave of relief that hit Malik was so intense, it felt like his bones might melt. He sat down in a nearby chair, face in his hands, and cried for the first time, not in fear, but in sheer, overwhelming gratitude. His best friend was alive, and somehow, against all odds, they had made it. Later that afternoon, after showering off the dried blood and shattered glass, Malik returned to the hospital. He wasn't alone this time. He'd picked up 2 of their friends from the party, including Kelsey, who had been racked with guilt since hearing what had happened. They waited nearly an hour before being allowed into the ICU, grouped into small pairs so as not to overwhelm Trey. Malik went in with Kelsey. The hallway leading to Trey's room felt longer than any road he'd driven that night. Every step echoed with anxiety. Every passing monitor beeped like a countdown. When they finally reached the door and stepped inside, Malik braced himself for the worst. Trey lay still, pale against the white sheets, a web of tubes snaking from his arms and chest. But when his eyes fluttered open and focused on them, a tiny smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Malik felt something break open in his chest. He stepped closer, gripped Trey's hand, and gave it the lightest squeeze. "You saved my life," Trey whispered, his voice barely audible. Malik shook his head. "No, man. You saved mine." He went on to explain quietly that when the shots were fired, Trey hadn't yet opened his car door. Malik's interior lights stayed off, but Trey's phone bright screen pointed outward had illuminated his chest like a spotlight. "He probably used that light to aim," Malik said, voice cracking. "If you weren't there, that bullet, it would have been for me." Trey didn't respond, just closed his eyes and nodded slowly. It was a moment that didn't need any more words. In that quiet room filled with beeping machines and low whispers, they both understood something neither of them would ever forget. That night had changed them forever. About a week after the shooting, Malik got the call he wasn't sure he wanted. The man who fired the shots. Howard Vick, a 57-year-old homeowner, had pleaded no contest to a charge of attempted manslaughter. The court documents revealed that his house had been targeted by 2 separate break-in attempts in the previous year. One group had already been arrested and sentenced, and during that trial, someone had reportedly warned Vic that his crew wasn't done with him. So when Malik's unfamiliar car rolled quietly into his driveway late at night, Vic didn't wait to find out who it was. He opened fire from an upstairs window shoot first. Ask questions never. His attorney argued that he'd acted out of fear, not malice. Maybe that was true. Maybe he was just a man pushed to the edge by threats and paranoia. But that didn't make it right. Malik still had Trey's blood in his trunk weeks later. Still had trouble falling asleep unless the lights were on. In the end, Vic got 3 years in prison. It wasn't much Malik thought, but it was something. There'd been a moment during the hearing where it looked like Vic might walk away with probation. That was almost too much to bear. Trey surprisingly chose to forgive him. He was scared, he said softly one day. Fear makes people do stupid things. Malik wasn't so sure he could let it go that easily. Not when one flicker of panic had nearly gotten them both killed. It took Malik months to begin processing what happened that night. He started attending group therapy sessions for trauma survivors, something he never imagined himself doing. That's where he met Jordan, a former Marine who had been through combat overseas. When Malik hesitantly shared how he'd frozen during the shooting and even wet himself from fear, Jordan just laughed, not mockingly, but with a kind of knowing empathy. He told Malik it happened more often than anyone admitted. Doesn't mean you're weak, he said. It means you're alive. That simple sentence hit Malik harder than he expected. For the first time since the hospital, he didn't feel like a coward. He began to accept that survival wasn't about looking tough. It was about keeping your head when everything around you falls apart. And he had kept his head. He'd gotten them out alive. He didn't crash the car. He didn't freeze long enough to die. He did what had to be done. Still, every time he passed that street Manchac trace, his chest tightened. The house was just a house again now. No police tape, no reporters. But to Malik, it would always be that place, the one where the world tilted sideways for a few terrifying minutes. He still doesn't know if he fully forgives Howard Vick. Maybe one day, maybe not. But as he left that therapy session, a thought settled quietly in his mind. Sometimes you don't get closure. Sometimes you just get to live. And that has to be enough. Emma Carter met Caleb Morgan. The kind of way that feels too movie-like to be real, by spilling an iced coffee all over his shirt. It happened at a little cafe in downtown Charlotte, where Emma was working remotely, and Caleb stopped in after a shift at the nearby auto plant. She'd stood up to grab a napkin. He turned around with his drink in hand, and just like that coffee catastrophe. But instead of getting angry, Caleb just laughed it off, saying she owed him dry cleaning or dinner, whichever came first. That simple interaction turned into weekly coffee runs, long walks through Freedom Park, and shared playlists that said more than words ever could. By the time their second anniversary approached, they'd settled into a rhythm, two people with wildly different careers and personalities, yet strangely in sync. Emma, a detail-oriented marketing analyst, and Caleb, a hands-on, laid-back mechanic, balanced each other out. They didn't agree on everything. Emma preferred art museums. Caleb loved hiking trails, but they always found a middle ground. Their love wasn't flashy, but it was steady, kind, and genuine. When Caleb suggested a weekend away to celebrate their 2-year mark, it felt like the next natural chapter. Neither of them knew that what started as a lighthearted getaway would unravel into something darker. But in that moment, sitting side by side with their lattes and laughter, the only thing on their minds was how lucky they were to have found each other in a world full of chaos. As their second anniversary drew closer, Caleb brought up the idea over dinner at a cozy barbecue joint just off East Boulevard, his favorite kind of place, all smoky ribs and cold beer. "What if we got out of the city for a bit?" he said between bites, pulling out his phone to show Emma a cabin he'd bookmarked weeks ago. At first, she hesitated. "A cabin in the mountains," she echoed, imagining a spider-filled hunting shack, with no cell signal, and boiled venison for dinner. Caleb chuckled, knowing exactly what she was picturing. "It's not like that," he promised. "Just look." And when she did, her skepticism turned to surprise. Perched on a forested ridge outside a place called Tellico Plains, the cabin looked like something out of an upscale travel magazine. Vaulted ceilings, leather sofas, a stone fireplace, and even a hot tub under the stars. Emma was sold the moment she saw the farmhouse kitchen with its breakfast nook and antique light fixtures. But what sealed it was the idea of curling up with Caleb in front of the fireplace after a long day of exploring. It wasn't just a trip. It felt like a memory waiting to happen, the kind you carry with you. She nodded and smiled. Let's do it. For once, their differences had converged: his love of the outdoors, her love of comfort, and it all seemed to fit. What they didn't know then was just how far that trail would lead them from everything familiar. The following Friday, after 4 sweet and slightly chaotic days with Caleb's family in Knoxville, Emma and Caleb loaded up their rental SUV and headed southeast toward the mountains. The sun was shining. Their playlist was spot on, and spirits were high as they stopped for gas in Sweetwater and grabbed lunch in Chattanooga. Emma kept glancing at the printout of directions Caleb had folded neatly into the glove box, just in case the GPS decided to flake out. "You worry too much," he teased, but neither of them knew how prophetic that would feel just a few hours later. As they turned off the main roads and into the winding backcountry near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, their pace slowed and the signal bars on their phones disappeared. The hills grew steeper, the trees denser, and the gravel roads more confusing. The GPS sputtered and rerouted uselessly. Emma unfolded the paper map, but even that felt vague. Each turn bled into the next, until they weren't sure if they were heading toward Red Hollow Road or just circling the same patch of woods. Still, they pressed on, hopeful, laughing nervously, not knowing they were getting closer to something far more unsettling than just a wrong turn. After the third dead end and a sharp argument about whether they'd already passed that same crooked fence post, Emma and Caleb finally spotted something that wasn't trees. Gravel or more forest, an old house tucked back at the end of a dirt lane just beyond a bend they'd nearly missed. It looked tired and long forgotten, slumped slightly into the ground, like it had been waiting decades for someone to show up. The paint might have once been white, but now it was a patchy mess of peeling wood and mossy streaks. The roof sagged in spots, and one corner of the porch looked dangerously close to collapse. But to Emma, it wasn't creepy, just old. Remote. Maybe even charming in a Southern Gothic kind of way. Caleb slowed the SUV, then pulled into the clearing beside it. "They've probably lived out here forever," he said. "Might know these roads like the back of their hand." With no cell signal and no other houses in sight, it seemed like their best shot. The porch creaked as Caleb stepped onto the first board. Almost immediately, they heard faint movement inside, like someone shifting behind a closed door. Every window was covered newspaper, dingy cloth, even a yellowed shower curtain, and Emma felt an odd unease creep in. Still, they waited. When Caleb knocked, the door opened just a sliver. A woman stood behind it, short, gray-haired and tight-lipped with a thick drawl, and eyes that didn't quite smile. She said her husband knew the area better than she did, but was out running errands. If they wanted, they could wait on the porch. Caleb thanked her kindly, and they took a seat on a weathered porch swing that groaned under their weight. Emma didn't say it out loud, but something about the house, the way it watched more than stood, felt deeply wrong. The longer they sat, the quieter everything around them seemed to get. No birdsong, no breeze, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the ticking of the cooling engine. Caleb tried to keep the mood light, cracking a few jokes, and reminding Emma they were basically just waiting for the mountain version of AAA. But the unease that had crawled up her spine earlier refused to leave. The swing creaked beneath them as they rocked gently, but Emma's eyes kept drifting to the house, the mismatched curtains, the boarded-up second-floor window, and the faint but unmistakable smell of smoke that lingered near the door. After nearly an hour, Caleb stood and paced the porch, trying to stretch his legs while Emma pulled a protein bar from the glove box. It was around then that she muttered mostly to herself, "So much for Southern hospitality." She hadn't meant it harshly, just a nervous joke, but Caleb paused and turned to glance at the house. "Maybe they're just private," he said, his voice softer now. "Maybe they like being left alone." He gestured for Emma to stand and look. Every single window on the ground floor was blocked heavy fabric cardboard, even tinfoil on one. Upstairs the same. Not one square inch of glass uncovered. Emma didn't want to say it out loud, but the word trapped started to whisper somewhere in the back of her mind. Still, they stayed because getting lost again felt worse. They were just about ready to give up when the sound of tires crunching gravel broke the silence. A beat-up pickup truck came winding around the bend in the road, and Caleb let out a relieved breath. "That's gotta be him," he said, already stepping off the porch. Emma stood too heart-lifting slightly watching as the truck rolled closer and came to a stop beside their rental. An older man in a denim shirt and canvas jacket stepped out, boots thudding softly on the ground. He looked every bit the backwoods local, grizzled, sun-worn, and wary. Caleb raised both hands slightly, signaling peace as he walked toward him. "Hey there," he called. "Sorry to bother you. We got turned around trying to find Red Hollow Road." The man didn't speak right away, just stared. Then slowly he shifted his weight and reached back to close his truck door. Emma watched Caleb slow his approach, a little unsure now, but still hopeful. That's when she heard the voice behind her. "My husband's home now," said the woman, her voice sweet but off-kilter like a lullaby, played slightly out of tune. Emma turned and saw the same tight-lipped smile, but this time it stretched wider, unnaturally so. Something about it made her stomach flip. When she turned back to Caleb, he had stopped moving. His arms were raised, palms out, backing away from the man who now held a pistol leveled straight at him. No, wait!" Caleb shouted, but the shot came before he could finish. Emma screamed as Caleb dropped to the ground. She barely had time to process the sound of the gunshot before the woman burst through the screen door wielding a hatchet, charging at her with terrifying speed. Instinct kicked in. Emma didn't think she ran. She jumped off the porch, stumbling, but landing hard, her knees scraping the gravel as she pushed herself up and darted behind the side of the house. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to put something, anything between herself and the man with the gun. The woman gave chase, shrieking behind her, but Emma heard the thud of a body hitting the ground and a grunt of pain. She didn't look back. That small sound, an old woman falling, not a bullet, might have been the only reason she got away. But even in her panicked sprint, Emma knew the man wouldn't be far behind. He'd already taken Caleb from her. There was no chance he was letting her leave alive. Emma ran harder than she ever had in her life, her breath catching in her throat as tree limbs whipped at her face and her sneakers slid across mossy ground. All she could think of was Caleb, how fast he dropped, how final it looked. The sound of the gunshot kept replaying in her head like a sick drum beat. She didn't know where she was going, only that forward was better than back. Somewhere between the branches and panic, her sister's voice echoed in her mind. They'd once watched a true crime show together, and her sister had said, "They always kill the guy first, so they can take their time with the woman." That single thought ignited something primal in her. She wasn't just running from danger, she was running from whatever horror those two had waiting for her. Her legs burned. Her lungs felt like they were on fire, but she didn't stop. At one point, she tripped on a root and hit the ground so hard the wind left her body. She spat dirt and kept moving. The idea of slowing down meant death. A clean shot. A cold floor. Or worse, she kept running until she felt sick, really sick, and bent over to vomit behind a cluster of pines. Everything she and Caleb had eaten that day came up, and with it, a piece of her heart. She knew deep down he was gone. When she finally reached a clearing and saw a narrow gravel road cutting through the trees, it felt unreal. Her knees wobbled as she stumbled toward it, eyes scanning for any sign of a house, a mailbox, a sign of life. Then, off in the distance, she spotted the silhouette of what looked like a fire lookout or ranger tower. She staggered toward it, not knowing if it was manned or abandoned, but it didn't matter. She just needed someone to hold on to before the woods swallowed her too. The ranger tower turned out to be empty, just a locked metal door and weather-worn steps leading nowhere. But Emma didn't stop. She kept pushing through the woods until she stumbled onto a narrow paved road, the kind rarely used except by locals. After another hour of limping along its shoulder, she spotted a mailbox at the end of a gravel driveway and a modest white house tucked behind a cluster of oaks. Her entire body was shaking when she knocked on the door. A man in his 60s answered, startled by the sight of her dirt-streaked face and torn jeans. "Can I please use your phone?" she asked. Her voice hoarse. "My fiancé was just shot." The words hit the air like a stone. At first he blinked, confused, assuming maybe a hunting accident. But when Emma added, "It wasn't an accident, he was murdered," his face changed. He brought her inside, called the sheriff, and handed her a glass of water she could barely hold. Emma sat on their floral-patterned couch, shaking, barely able to process what she'd just survived, only knowing she had escaped something evil, buried deep in those woods. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, Emma did her best to explain where it had happened, though her memory of the roads was a blur of twisted turns and tree-lined paths. She pointed to a general area on a map describing the old house and the couple inside, the woman's smile, the man's silence, the gunshot. A search team combed the forested hills for days. When they finally located the property, all that remained was a pile of smoldering ash. The house had burned to the ground, no signs of the couple, no sign of Caleb, no bodies. Just scorched earth and charred wood. It was as if the place had been erased. Emma clung to hope for a while, but deep down, she knew. She'd seen the way Caleb fell. She knew he hadn't gotten back up. His parents kept him on the missing persons register for over 2 years, hoping someone might eventually find remains or a piece of clothing, anything to prove what they already feared. But 18 months ago, with heavy hearts, they had him declared legally dead. Emma never truly let go, but the world around her had no choice but to move on. The service was held on a gray October afternoon at a small chapel just outside Charlotte. Emma stood at the front of the room, palms trembling slightly, as she unfolded the paper she had rewritten a dozen times, but still didn't feel ready to read. Friends, family, co-workers, even a few of Caleb's old classmates filled the pews in silence waiting. Emma cleared her throat and began. "Caleb wasn't just my partner. He was my best friend. He made everything lighter, even the hard stuff. He loved old trucks, strong coffee, and that awful country playlist he made me listen to on road trips. But most of all, he loved with everything he had." She paused, pressing the paper against her chest. "I don't know why we ended up on that road, or why such a kind, good man was taken in such a senseless way. But I do know this: Caleb lived with purpose. He showed up for people, he noticed the small things, and he made every ordinary day feel like a gift." Her voice broke then, but she kept going. "Though our story ended far too soon, I carry him with me. In every fire pit under the stars, in every winding back road, in every laugh that catches me off guard, he's there. Still loving, still present, still mine." She stepped back from the lectern, unable to speak anymore, but she didn't need to. The weight of her grief had become something shared in that room. Real, raw, and rooted in a love that didn't disappear just because the person was gone. Outside, leaves rustled in a cold wind, and somewhere in the distance, far from chapel walls and polished shoes, the woods of Red Hollow kept their silence. Emma never returned to Red Hollow, not even when the nightmares pulled her back into those woods night after night. Some places don't deserve closure. Some answers only deepen the wound. But she learned to live again slowly. She took up hiking, strange as it was, and sometimes she'd find herself standing at a trail's edge, looking out across a sea of green and whispering Caleb's name into the wind. Not to summon him, but to remind herself he had lived, and loved, and mattered. The woods had taken something from her. Her, yes, but they hadn't taken everything. Not the memory, not the truth, and not the quiet, stubborn fire still burning in her chest. If this story moved you, unsettled you, or made you think twice about the roads we choose and the people we trust, consider subscribing. We share true inspired tales that dig deeper than jump scares, exploring the quiet terror hiding in everyday places. Your support helps us keep telling stories that linger long after the screen fades to black. So, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and share this with someone who thinks they'd never get lost. Because sometimes the scariest places are the ones that don't look scary at all.